First of all, I cut the lecture by half. So it's going to be about 15 minutes, 20 max. And I wish to try to answer the questions put forward by Harry and by Yaakov. And this is the moment, I mean, that I need to give some answers. And I wish at the second part of this very short presentation to deal with a very basic question, not with the whole compilation of the biblical text, but to put forward the question, when did it start? What's the starting point, the jumping board, for the beginning of authorship in Jerusalem, in Judah, in the Iron Age? Well, so we basically start here from the middle. Let me just fix it. Okay. So what I wish to do today now in this last presentation of today is to ask, in fact, two questions. First of all, to deal a little bit, to speak a little bit about this middle phase, the missing link in Jerusalem and Judah, what I see as the missing link, the 9th and early 8th century, and then to go over to the very important phase of the growth of Judah into full-blown statehood. So in the 10th and early 9th centuries, the southern hill country is, in general, and Jerusalem in particular, still featured what I would describe as an Amarna-like demographic and territorial political situation. A poor village in Jerusalem, where am I? Yeah, it's a poor village in Jerusalem, ruled over a very sparsely inhabited southern highlands. The first sign, by the way, I did not say so far that when we look at the surveys in the highlands of Judah, we are speaking about, in the 10th century, about something like 8 or 9 or 10 settlements altogether with a population of maybe 1,000 people. That means about 200 men, soldiers for conquests. So this is not exactly the Genghis Khan situation as far as I can judge. So a poor village in Jerusalem ruled over a very sparsely inhabited southern highlands. The first signs of statehood in Judah appeared during the 9th century. Most of the evidence for this early stage comes from the periphery of Judah. In the Shephelah, two sites are of special importance, Lachish and Bet Shemesh. In both towns, the first fortifications and other elaborate public buildings should be dated to the 9th century. Two Judahite sites in the Beersheba Valley, the fort of Arad and Beersheba, were also fortified for the first time in the 9th century. In Jerusalem, too, the first signs of significant building activity seems to date to that time. Two elaborate structures, known as the terraces and the stepped stone structure, were built on the eastern slope of the city of David, near the Gihon spring, in order to stabilize the slope and facilitate the construction of large building on the ridge. And from this point of view, the building that Elat Mazar excavated was expected. We all spoke about it without knowing that it will be revealed in future excavations. The latest sherds from the stepstone structure, a sort of a mantle that wrapped some of the old terraces, include iron 2A sherds. We saw them all. I will cut it short again. And therefore, in my opinion, the revetment there on the slope, which, I mean, the terraces started before, but the last phase of wrapping it with this kind of stepped stone structure is, in my opinion, from the 9th century, at least from the beginning of the Iron Age too. And the building that Elat Mazar excavated there dates to the same period. What brought about this sudden rise of Judah in the 9th century? The process could have, I'm tired. The process could have started in the early 9th century under North Israelite domination. The Omrides, who engaged in military expansion in the east and northeast, must have dominated the marginal state of Judah to the south. In fact, the second book of Kings, in what seems to be a reliable historical testimony, indirectly backed by the Tel Dan Stele, reveals that the Omrides may have tried to take over Judah, maybe even to annex it, by a royal diplomatic marriage of the Israelite princess Atalia with the Davidite king Jehoram. For a few decades in the first half of the 9th century, Israel managed to establish a great united monarchy which was ruled from Samaria. All this changed with the fall of the Omrides under the pressure of Damascus in the 830s. Hazael, king of Damascus, assaulted the northern kingdom, took back territories in the northeast and the Gilead, destroyed many of the Israelite centers in the valley, and pushed the northern kings into the limited territory of the highlands around Samaria. As a result, the northern kingdom's grip over Judah eased, and a coup in Jerusalem brought a Davidite, Jehoash, back to power. No less important events took place at that time in the Shephelah. Hazael campaigned in the coastal plain, besieged Gath, and conquered it. Recent excavations there at Gath in the western Shephelah, the location of ancient Gath, revealed dramatic evidence for these events. 9th century Gath was a huge city that stretched over an area of about 40 hectares. A sophisticated siege system, which included a deep trench, was laid around it, probably by Hazael. And inside the city, the dig showed that Gath was put to the torch and was completely destroyed. It never fully recovered from these events. So, for a short while, in the second half of the 9th century, a window of opportunities opened for Judah. In the north, Israel was severely weakened by the Aramean assault. In the west, Gath, the most powerful Philistine city, was destroyed by Hazael. Judah took advantage of this situation, expanded to the west, and built the administrative centers of Lachish and Bet Shemesh. In Judah, then, the real change from the early situation of the Iron One to a territorial state took place in the second half of the 9th century, maybe before, maybe the first half of the 9th century, it's difficult to say, either before or in the wake of the temporary decline of the northern kingdom. And this brings me to the main subject of this short presentation, the great leap forward in Judah and the meaning for biblical authorship. The situation which I have just described, the first signs of statehood in Judah, continued into the beginning of the 8th century. Several decades later, the southern kingdom was utterly revolutionized. In the late 8th century, Jerusalem grew to be the largest city in the entire country. It was surrounded by a system of massive fortifications, 2 walls on the eastern slope of the city of David, and a 7 meters thick wall in the west, on the western hill. Water was supplied by the Siloam Tunnel, which led from the Gihon Spring to a pool in the southern tip of the valley, separating between the ridge of the city of David and the western hill, a location more accessible for the many inhabitants of the new quarters in the west. Elaborate rock-cut tombs began to be hewn around the city, testifying to the existence of an affluent elite. In the southern hill country, as well as in the plateau to the north of Jerusalem, the number of settlements and the total built-up area grew dramatically. Both grew considerably also in the Shephelah and the Beersheba Valley. In the late 8th century, Judah reached its peak territory and largest population of all times. Well-planned countryside towns, such as Beersheba and Tel Beit Mirsim, represent a highly organized state. The high level of organization of the Judahite state at that time is indicated in many other areas. Monumental inscriptions in the Siloam Tunnel and on the facades of the Siloam tombs appear at that time, and the number of seals and seal impressions and ostraca grows dramatically. Standardized weights also appear for the first time. The Lamelech storage jars that you see now and seal impressions of officials found on some of the jars also attest to an advanced bureaucratic apparatus. Finally, this is the time when the economy of Judah grows considerably. For the first time, pottery is mass-produced, and Judah engages in large-scale, state-controlled olive oil production in the Shephelah. In a very short period of time then, in the second half of the 8th century, Judah developed into a highly bureaucratic state. Two momentous events seem to have stimulated these developments: the incorporation of the kingdom into the Assyrian global economy, which must have started in the days of Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria and King Ahaz of Judah in the 730s, and the fall of the northern kingdom in 722-720. Starting in 732, Judah participated in the Assyrian-dominated Arabian trade. This was the main reason for the prosperity of the Beersheba Valley, along the route that led from Arabia via Edom to the Mediterranean ports, which were turned into Assyrian emporia. Somewhat later, apparently after the destruction of Ashdod and the rise of Ekron in the days of Sargon II, Judahite olive oil must have been traded to Assyria and other clients, possibly via the oil production center at Ekron. Equally important events took place in parallel to these developments after the fall of the northern kingdom. Now, the key phenomenon, in my opinion, the key phenomenon for understanding the beginning of biblical authorship, if not more than that, which cannot be explained on the background of economic prosperity, is the sudden growth of the population of Jerusalem, in particular and Judah in general. In a few decades in the late 8th century, Jerusalem grew in size from 5 to about 60 hectares, and in population from, let's say, around 1,000 inhabitants to over 10,000. That's a big city at that time. The population of the Judahite countryside also grew dramatically. Assuming that in the late 8th century, in a matter of a few decades, the population of Judah doubled, would be a modest, probably underestimated evaluation. This sudden increase in the population of Judah cannot be explained as a natural growth or as a result of a peaceful migration from neighboring areas. The only reasonable way to explain this unprecedented demographic development is as a result of a flow of refugees from the north following the conquest of Israel by Assyria. All this means that the great leap forward, I'm using a Chinese term here in Chinese history, in the demography of Judah took place in a very short period of time between 732, but mainly 722, and 700 BC, or a few years later. In a matter of three or two decades, Judah was totally revolutionized. It was transformed from an isolated, formative tribal state into a developed state, fully incorporated into Assyrian global economy. And no less important, the population dramatically changed from purely Judahite to a mix of Judahite and ex-Israelites. And this is the most important thing. An assumption that up to half, I repeat, an assumption that up to half of the Judahite population in the late 8th and early 7th century BC was of North Israelite origin cannot be too far from reality. A close look at the results of archaeological surveys in the highlands seems to indicate that many of the Israelites who moved to Judah came from the area between Shechem and Jerusalem. This is the area where one can detect a dramatic decline in the number of settlements and their overall size in the transition from the, say, 8th century to the Persian period in the 5th century. Even if the long period between these two datum lines saw several oscillations, it is clear that southern Samaria suffered a major demographic blow in the wake of the conquest of the northern kingdom by Assyria. Indeed, this is also hinted by the fragmentary clues on the locations where the Assyrians settled Mesopotamian deportees. These clues seem to specifically point to the southern part of the northern kingdom and the vicinity of Bethel. Many Israelites seem to have fled this area in fear of deportation, and foreign groups were settled in their stead. These people must have come to Judah with their own local traditions, and here, Yaakov, I start answering you, with their own local traditions. Most significantly, the Bethel sanctuary must have played an important role in their cult practices. And the memories and myths of the Seoulite Dynasty, which originated from this area, the first dynasty of the north, could have played an essential role in their understanding of their history and identity. In Judah, the new demographic situation must have presented a challenge to the southern leadership, an urgent need to unite the two segments of the society, Judahites and Israelites, into one entity. And the main problems that needed to be addressed were probably the different, not to say alien and hostile, cult and royal traditions of the northerners who settled in Judah. Indeed, in the late 8th century, King Hezekiah and his Jerusalem elite focused the new nation around the Jerusalem Temple and the Davidic dynasty. Hezekiah is remembered in the Bible as one of the most righteous kings who carried out a sweeping religious reform in Judah. Scholars have debated the historicity of this reform, some accepting it as reliable, while others raising doubts or rejecting it altogether on purely textual grounds. We have no information about the possible changes made to the Jerusalem Temple in this period, as it lies inaccessible to archaeologists beneath the Muslim shrines on the Temple Mount. Yet, there is evidence in some of the outlying centers of the kingdom that dramatic changes in the nature of public worship were underway at the end of the 8th century. Excavations at three sites, Arad, Beersheba, and Lachish, seem to have unearthed evidence for 8th century shrines or cult places which were abolished before the end of the century. It is no less important to note that none of the many 7th and early 6th century BC sites excavated in Judah produced evidence for the existence of a sanctuary. So you have to look at it from both sides. It seems plausible that in the late 8th century, Judahite countryside sanctuaries were abolished, probably as part of an effort to centralize the state cult in Jerusalem. Yet this process should be seen from socio-economic and political rather than strictly religious perspectives. It probably aimed at strengthening the unifying elements of the state, the central authority of the king and the elite in the capital, and at weakening the old, regional, clan-based leadership in the countryside. No less important, it was essential to deal with the northern cult traditions which were brought to Judah by the Israelite refugees. The most important of these locales was the Bethel Temple, situated in the midst of their ancestral villages. It seems that the solution was a ban on all sanctuaries, countryside shrines in Judah, and the Bethel Temple alike, except for the royal temple in Jerusalem. Putting the early history of the Davidic dynasty in writing was another tool in the remaking of Judah. And here we go to the question of memory. Scholars have divided the story of the early days of the Davidic dynasty into two main narratives: the history of David's rise to power and the court or succession history. Both contain information about the Seoulites, the first northern dynasty, and both are not complementary to King David, Yaakov. They include hinted allegations against the founder of the Jerusalem dynasty for cooperating with the Philistines, betraying his fellow Israelites, being responsible for the death of the first king of Israel, being liable for the death of other key figures related to Saul, and being accountable for other murders and wrongdoings, such as the case of Absalom and Bathsheba. Most of these accusations deal with the themes related to the Seoulites of the north. Most scholars dated these narratives to the 10th century or immediately thereafter, and argued that they were put in writing in order to legitimize David and Solomon. They aimed at explaining how David came to power and why Solomon, who was not the first to the throne, succeeded him in Jerusalem. But why would the authors and later redactors leave the negative stories and accusations against King David in the text? Scholars suggested that much of the material was written as an apologia to counter these allegations, to vindicate King David of any wrongdoing, and to explain what really happened according to the point of view of the dynasty. By the way, the chronicler, the author of Chronicles, took all this material out. So why did the author of Samuel did not do the same? The apologia theory is also, nice picture. The apologia theory is also somewhat problematic, as it fails to deal with the key question. Why should the author deal with these accusations at all? In a great Davidic Solomonic empire, the author could simply ignore these stories. The fundamental question in dating and understanding the story of the early Davidites should therefore be, what is the period that best fits a compilation of a saga which takes into account negative northern traditions about the founder of the Jerusalem dynasty? To put this in different words, what is the period in which the author, certainly a Judahite, needed to counter these traditions with an apologia without being able to eliminate them? On one hand, the answer to this question must fit what we know about literacy in Judah. That is, it can hardly be any time before the second half of the 8th century. On the other hand, these texts cannot be dated too late because it is quite obvious that they went through a late 7th century Deuteronomistic reduction, so you are caught there in the middle between the two poles. When we consider all the above on the background of the broader historical situation, the most reasonable period in this time frame is the late 8th century, after the fall of the north, when the population of Judah swelled dramatically to include large numbers of Israelite refugees. Parallel to the centralization of the Judahite cult in Jerusalem, the Judahite royal family and its entourage must have engaged in a project of strengthening the power of the dynasty by uniting Southerners and Northerners about the Davidic king. To that end, they needed to bridge the two narratives regarding the early days of the dynasty: the upbeat Southern traditions on David, its founder, and Solomon, the builder of the temple, and the disapproving Northern traditions. As I have already indicated, many of the Northerns who lived in Judah must have come from southern Samaria. This was the area where the first Northern chiefdom or state emerged, and where the Seoulite traditions, the traditions on Seoul, were probably still strong. So an attempt was made to reconcile the two traditions. Instead of ignoring the Northern accusations, the authors included them in the story, but at the same time gave the Southern version, which vindicated David for almost all wrongdoing. That is to say, they tell you, the Northerners, that David is responsible for the death of Saul. So the author says, yes, we know that, but this was not exactly what happened. Look very carefully and see, David was not there at Mount Gilboa, and so on and so forth. The Great Apologia was also the great reconciliation between South and North within Judah, and a platform for the rise of the pan-Israelite ideology. This was the moment when this concept first appeared, and behind it was a situation of all Israel within the borders of Judah, not necessarily all Israel in all ex-Israelite territories. And this was also the point of departure for over 3 centuries of scribal activity that gave us the biblical history of Israel. Now, I need only one more sentence to finish it, to wrap it up. So we have, in my opinion, the beginning of authorship in the time of Hezekiah, after the fall of the north, when a torrent of refugees from the north, Israelites, settled in Judah. And Judah is not Judah anymore. It's, in fact, when you look at the demographic situation, half Judah, half Israel at that time. And then they incorporate the traditions from the north into the saga and put them together and bridge them together. I think that there is far more to that that we can show. And in fact, Bill Schneiderwind, the biblical scholar from California, from the University of California in Los Angeles, put forward the same ideas regarding the putting together prophetic works of both North and South together in the Codex, 2 8th century Northern prophets and 2 8th century Southern prophets, in a new book that he wrote a while ago. But when they accommodated the Northern traditions, we need to remember that we cannot look at these traditions, and I repeat, and this is regarding memory, they accommodated the traditions, yes, But when they took the traditions in the 8th century, these were not anymore the original memories exactly of the 10th century. These were memories of a long period of time in the north with an accumulation of influences, of material, of traditions, starting in the very early time of the 10th century regarding Saul vis-a-vis David, and continuing when these traditions went down the pipeline from the 10th century to the 8th century, and on the way down absorbed later influences and later traditions. Thank you.